Thank you all for joining us for today's ASCE Texas section webinar titled Reliability and Resilience in the Balance, Part 5, Network Interdependence Issues and Conclusions. What can we do about it? I'm Chris Nance. I'm the current VP Tech-elect for the Texas section, filling in for our VP of Technical Affairs, Mark Boyd. I'm a water resources engineer and associate for Park Hill, located in our El Paso office. I would also like to thank the branches for hosting viewing sites across Texas as the State Association for Civil Engineers. We're really happy to provide this service to the engineering community. And if you're not a member of ASCE or the Texas section, I'd invite you to become a member so that you can benefit from being a part of this professional organization and all the gratifying and meaningful volunteer opportunities it offers. So one quick anecdote, in addition to being on mountain time during February of 2021, I got to be a little bit of a spectator from the Western interconnection to what was happening in the rest of Texas. And our headquarters, Park Hill's headquarters, is in Lubbock, and Lubbock Power and Light since 2015 had been working towards connecting to ERCOT. They were on the Southwest Power Pool at the time, and through some delays, the scheduled switchover date didn't happen until June of 2021. But I remember that being a very, very stressful time as they were worried about connecting to ERCOT right after all of this. So anyway, this being our fifth and last part of the webinar series, our speakers really should need no introduction. So I am pleased to introduce our presenters for today's webinar, Jeff Roberts and Oliver Smith. Take it away.
Thank you. Well, welcome to the sixth and final webinar of the Texas chapter of American Society of Civil Engineers Infrastructure Network Resilience Committee's presentation of the Beyond Storms, Reliability and Resilience in the Balance. Hopefully, many of you have joined us in the prior webinars, but whether this is your sixth webinar for you or the very first one, thank you for attending. Today, we're going to provide a summary of the Beyond Storms webinars, the ones that have been presented to date, and give you a sense of what happened, why it happened, and our key recommendations. There are many ways to fix a problem, and we have purposely tried to avoid prescribing how the problem should be fixed, and instead we focus on the outcome, or the what is needed to prevent this tragedy from repeating itself. Lastly, we'll provide an updated view of the progress of change to date and where we see material gaps and the required next steps. Remember that there were in fact two storms, Viola and Uri. Together, these two storms caused tremendous economic and human suffering, $200 to $300 billion in damages and at least 246 lives lost. During the peak of these twin storms, ASCE volunteers from across the state of Texas began to analyze and drill deeply into questions of what happened, but also to try and unravel why it happened, with a particular focus on reliability and resilience. It was challenging because many participants were reluctant to share information, and especially attribution, and because many questions could not be immediately answered. In the end, this team of over 25 volunteers invested 12 months in analyzing the what and why and developing recommendations about what was needed to fix the identified problems. Since the report was released in February 2022 on the one-year anniversary of the storms, the team has made extensive education outreach efforts to legislators, regulators, industry, and the public about our findings. One of our key takeaways for everyone to understand is that the storms may have uncovered a problem, but the problems extended far beyond the storms. Blaming the weather, candidly, will fail to fix the underlying problems. Believing that last winter's lack of a similar experience means that the problem must have already been solved is like believing in Santa Claus. And it's disappointing to say that while we are making progress, I think we are probably still on the naughty list. The scale and impact of the storms created a highly charged political environment. Many decisions were rushed and based upon incomplete information at the local, state, and federal level. The result is that some cases an early bias was formed and parties stopped asking the question why, and instead jumped to conclusions and recommendations. ERCOT was a target for a lot of the blame. Some may be deserved, and some may not. When you first understand that ERCOT does not make the rules, but it serves in a function like an air traffic controller, implementing the rules created by legislators and developing in detail by regulatory bodies. We focused on what actions were needed, recognizing that there are a lot of different ways how a problem can be resolved. We deferred to the legislative, regulatory, and industry committees to develop the detailed responses. However, we will identify the problem if the how is inadequate or falls short of achieving the outcome or the what is needed. So let's make sure we start with common language and definition before we go any further. We'll start first with essential infrastructure. Essential infrastructure provides essential services for social and economic well-being. It's often thought of as public, but can be either public or privately owned. This report focuses its analysis on and recommendations on 5 core essential infrastructure sectors. Hence, we've had 5 presentations so far. Focus on power, water, energy, transportation, and telecommunications, and then ultimately how those all fit together on a network basis. Reliability. It's binary. It's like a switch. For essential infrastructure, it means having access to what you need when you need it. Resilience. Think of that as a backstop for reliability. It provides support during periods of stress. And if it fails, resilience helps to support a rapid recovery after a failure. So there are 2 reported problems that were issue number 1 and issue number 2. Issue number 1 were problems with the energy-only market model. Number 2 was revenue insufficiency. We put these both together because they are very related. There are a variety of different what-if studies that have tried to determine the hypothetical benefits of the energy-only model over time. And they range from the Wall Street Journal's net cost assessment, meaning that the energy-only market model resulted in higher costs than it would have experienced by retaining its prior model, to other independent views that believe the energy-only model that has resulted in a net gain for Texas. The reality is, no one knows. However, regardless of how you look at history, both of these figures pale in comparison to the negative economic impact from the reliability and resilience failures experienced from Viola and Uri. The ERCOT-only energy market model failed to prioritize reliability and resilience with a singular focus on short-run, low cost. Reliability and resilience was devalued by the energy-only market. This led to various problems, including underinvestment in critical black start generators that provide fail-safe backup to restart the grid during extreme emergencies. It also created a problem called revenue insufficiency. Revenue insufficiency is when the owner of the asset is unable to recover its capital investment and its fixed and variable costs. This led to owners underinvesting in weatherization, reliance on interruptible gas supply and transport, and underinvestment in reliability. What is particularly frustrating in this debate is that we believe, as good stewards, that the estimated cost to solve the problem of revenue insufficiency in this instance to support the critical need of reliability is modest, equivalent to a little bit less than 5% of the ERCOT market revenues. Another way to consider this is, would you spend $2 to avoid the potential risk of $200 to $300? It is less than 1% of the catastrophic costs incurred during Viola and Uri. That feels like affordable insurance. Lastly, there was also a bias in forecasting models that tended to underestimate risks by reliance on averages, backcasting historical data, and inconsistent assumptions about conditions during system-wide stress. Page 6, issue 3, the overlooked problem of interdependence. When we consider infrastructure, we usually consider each of them as silos, whether we are users, regulators, legislators, or engineers. This bias tends to substantially underestimate the risk of interdependence, a problem that ultimately led to cascading failures across infrastructure sectors. So what is interdependence? It is a dependence of one sector for its reliability based upon the reliability of another different infrastructure sector. Some examples include the electric industry obviously relies on the natural gas industry for fuel supply. The natural gas industry in turn relies on the electricity industry to keep its wells from freezing off and SCADA controls. The water industry relies on electricity and telecom industry to deliver clean drinking water. The problems occur in the gap. Little decisions like conversion from natural gas heat to electric heat pumps becomes a potential systemic risk when the discrete decision is multiplied by thousands of individual decisions, especially when the temperatures are beyond the normal ambient conditions and the heat pump must rely on backup electric resistance heating, which is equivalent to relying on a toaster to heat your home. Slide 7, the regulatory changes to support reliability and resilience. Heavily subsidized non-dispatchable generation at both the federal and the state level created a revenue insufficiency problem in ERCOT, where reliability was not valued and resulted in the conclusion that the energy-only model should be more accurately described as a run-to-fail model. Critical load filings. The filing indicate a load is being basically assigned a priority to avoid interruption. Before the storm, there are approximately 100 filings across ERCOT. Now, there are over 65,000 filings across ERCOT. Does this mean that this problem is fixed? Of course not. The mistaken bias is that the issue is solved when in fact, all we've done is fix the paperwork. The paperwork does not change the physics. Serious interdependence problems remain. What could have happened if Texas had widespread icing conditions coincident with Uri and Viola? There's also a fundamental question of whether distribution utilities can timely manage the dispatch of the system in support of CLF. These are all additive and are incremental to making the critical load filings work. Another regulatory issue that has largely escaped attention, and that is how the intrastate natural gas market works. There's been a lack of transparency and dynamic price, supply, and transportation awareness between transportation and supply customers that must compete against the bundled sales obligations made by the same party that transports and supplies natural gas to electric generators. Slide 8, the impact, feedback, and response to the Texas ASCE report. In presentations and discussions with industry and ERCOT, there were no material disagreements concerning our findings and our recommendations. During meetings this past summer with legislators, members were affirmative to our input. Several third-party articles have referenced our report, including a very positive review by Forbes magazine. Education and outreach continue through webinars like this one, podcasts, and presentation to industry participants and the general public. Slide 9, progress on solutions to improve reliability. ERCOT implemented grid management strategies to temporarily increase reliability incentives as a Band-Aid approach as longer-term solutions are developed. The Texas Railroad Commission has significantly increased its collaboration and coordination efforts with the PUCT and with ERCOT in anticipation of winter storm events. Senate Bill 3 set the stage to address issues that have developed over 21 years since the inception of the deregulated market. The individual responsible governmental entities responsible for implementing Senate Bill 3 include the Public Utility Commission, TRCC, TRRC, etc. They formed various subgroups and committees with active industry participation. These newly created entities in turn began working through the quantity of details and implementing the supporting changes. A note of concern: potential solutions to address the issue of revenue sufficiency have created the most contention and diversity of viewpoint. ERCOT's leadership has re-emphasized the importance and priority of reliability and resilience. This is an absolute critical step to starting a cultural change. So how's the infrastructure itself changed? Well, ERCOT is employing reliability utility commitments to contract for power generators in advance of peak demand. This is providing additional assurance that power will be there when it is needed. Following financial support, dispatchable power generators have taken steps and made investments to winterize their facilities. You can see an example on the side of the slide. Natural gas producers have added windbreaks, insulation, and additional trace heating to critical valves and piping in critical production fields to mitigate freeze-offs and mitigate at least some level of interdependence. There's more proactive engagement of consumers to become part of the solution to reduce demand through text messaging and other means during periods when the grid is stressed. Lastly, there is substantial improved coordination between the Public Utility Commission of Texas, ERCOT, Texas Railroad Commission, Texas DOT, water utilities, TCEQ, public safety, state and local governments throughout extreme weather events. But there are some things that have not changed. New dispatchable generating investors remain in what I would describe as a wait and see mode 21 months after Uri and Viola. Based upon the long history created by the problem of revenue insufficiency, it's extremely unlikely that they will respond with incremental new dispatchable generation investment that the market needs to achieve reliability unless and until the path to resolving revenue sufficiency is clear, simple, transparent, and stable or predictable. Severe weather mitigation for non-dispatchable generation, including a winterization standard for new wind turbines, and confirming a severe wind loading standard for solar are another aspect to that is left undone that needs to continue to have focus upon. Mitigating island risk. ERCOT is effectively an electric island, physically isolated from other markets except for 5 direct current interconnects. Supplement as needed high reliability black start capacity with dual fuel capability to mitigate island risk and ensure emergency capabilities. In addition, we need to evaluate potential temporary emergency solutions to connect to eastern or western interconnects if coincident weather stress and demand issues can be sufficiently mitigated. If you're both in sinking boats, throwing a line to the other boat doesn't necessarily help you feel safe. Lastly, modeling with forward and backcasting of data with increased sensitivity to extremes, not just averages, is also needed. So bridging to a more reliable scenario, ERCOT 2023. NERC, North American Reliability Corporation, did a seasonal assessment of ERCOT's ability to meet seasonal operating reserve. In essence, the ability to meet the demand and have reserve capacity. If normal winter conditions apply, we're okay. If, however, we apply the stress test, the situation like what we experienced with Viola and Uri, it's reasonable to expect a shortfall of 18.1 gigawatts. This analysis was then subsequently generally confirmed by ERCOT in early December 22. So this stress scenario indicates that we would experience a loss of about 25% of the load or the demand in ERCOT, not an insubstantial amount. This is basically a clear indication that the long-term reliability and resilience issues have not been resolved. To quote the PUCT chair, our threat is real and it's happening. We're losing megawatts at the same time that we have more people and more businesses. I'll now hand this over for the balance of the presentation to Oliver Smith. Oliver?
Thank you, Jeff. You are here. Most of you are familiar with that, especially now that you're doing your holiday shopping at the outlet malls and you're trying to find the stores that you want to peruse. Holding that thought, let me show you where the state of Texas is in the process of legislating solutions required by Senate Bill 3 to improve the reliability of the electric grid and the overall infrastructure of the state as it responds to changing weather conditions. The desired outcome as reflected on the left-hand side of the screen, was a reliability standard for electrical power generation that the Public Utilities Commission and ERCOT would meet through market design and regulatory activities sometime between now and the year 2026. At this point, that standard or goal has been established as 1 day of outage in 10 years, which is a common and traditional reliability standard in the other two grids of the United States and in other countries. The challenge centers on finding a market solution that has the potential to attract new investment in dispatchable power generation facilities, as there's already plenty of financial incentive for non-dispatchable, i.e. wind and solar power, as well as finding an option that creates transparency, building the trust of the consumer base in the reliability of the power generation grid. And I'm certain most of you have interacted with people who have basically said they don't trust the power grid at this point. Basically, they say they don't trust ERCOT, but that's the same as saying they don't trust the power grid. The November 17th meeting of the Senate Business and Commerce Committee, which I attended, revealed the barriers that exist currently to addressing this challenge. And they include the perception that Jeff referred to earlier, that the problem is solved based on recent history and incomplete information. The use of reliability utility commitments and other ancillary services have given some legislators the feeling that we can retain the energy-only market and avoid issues of power interruption. There's also a willingness, a lack of willingness to consider material changes to achieve the needed outcome. There continue to be inconsistent communications or support from consultants to the Public Utilities Commission associated with modeling the output of the generating grid and market options that would be appropriate for enhancing the attractiveness of the Texas electrical grid for investment. There are limited checks and balances to avoid what are perceived to be excessive windfall revenue and margins. And finally, the perception that changes to the energy, that if you change from the energy only model to something else, then there will be excessive price increases to the customer base in ERCOT. During that meeting of the Senate Business and Commerce Committee, one senator implored the Public Utilities Commission and ERCOT not to build a Rolls-Royce power grid and have the end users pay higher utility bills in order to cover it. This is standard commentary suggesting that engineers will always gold plate infrastructure. It also ignores the consequences that an unreliable grid carries substantial financial and human costs and is not the foundation needed for building a bright future for Texas. Shay Rawlson, one of our presenters and an assistant director of the City of Austin Water Department, suggested that it is time to flip the script in discussing designs and operating procedures and market structure with legislators and public officials. We believe that a different model to frame our intended engineered outcome is something akin to a Caterpillar bulldozer, a reliability-oriented solution. in the case of the Texas electrical grid and the infrastructure in general, the objectives of such a flip the script approach would be: first, protect the most vulnerable components of the Texas infrastructure, namely energy supply, power generation, water supply, communications, particularly SCADA, and our most vulnerable end user services. Second, have built-in protections to support infrastructure operations. Black Start is an example. In this case, adequate dispatchable power generation also that backs up the intermittent non-dispatchable power generation, and other features built into our infrastructure that provide additional protection. Third, exceptional SCADA across all the vulnerable components of the energy and electrical grid to provide situational awareness and the ability to detect early and verify issues and their locations for immediate redress. Fourth, a market structure that respects the nature of the service level, that is, high reliability required, and incorporates the costs associated with the requirements for resilience and fail-safe operations. These objectives, in our opinion, represent the essential core elements of the design and operation of Caterpillar bulldozers, which cannot be confused with gold plating. These considerations reflect reliable, durable, and resilient characteristics, fitting what we believe are the performance standards for critical essential infrastructure that Texas should be working to achieve. Now, we've stepped ahead and using the green, yellow, red light indicators, and we've determined that our assessment of the current state of progress toward achieving a reliable and resilient infrastructure in Texas as of today is as follows. For Black Start generation, it's yellow. There are regulatory actions in place to provide dual fuel and reliability standards, but firm fuel and transport contracts are still needed to provide more thermal power generation units, especially units that can be started up very quickly at peak demand periods. We refer to those as peakers. On revenue sufficiency, well, we're at a red. The modeling and the capacity model and retention of energy-only market using performance credit mechanisms are being explored, but the biggest unresolved risks revolve around creative solutions that provide certainty and transparency to potential investors. Or we have a high probability of repeating the experience of Viola and Uri, which NERC and ERCOT have already suggested could happen. The fix requires more than a tweak of the current market structure. Model bias, we have regulatory actions in place from SB3 that give us a yellow sign. So, but what we see is the need for further stress testing and forward projecting scenarios. And by forward projecting, I mean anticipating changes in climate that will exacerbate severe winter events as we go forward. And we want there to be complete transparency in reflecting what those model assumptions are. Finally, culture. The Senate Committee and Business and Commerce Committee halted the modeling of alternative market designs and requested that the state, that ERCOT and the PUC continue to tweak the current energy-only model. Unfortunately, that renders progress as a red. There has to be commitment and flexibility from the leadership of the state, along with the willingness to have iterative solutions tested with adoption at all levels of the organization, of the business, of the Texas state entities involved. So the key takeaway on this slide is that the progress is slower than we would have valued in finalizing solutions to these complex issues, and some critical issues remain unresolved. Now, what else has happened as far as interdependence is concerned in connection with the infrastructure sectors? Well, let's take the natural gas sector as a beginning. We rate them as a yellow because they have stepped in, particularly in the Permian Basin, and added insulation, heat tracing, and windbreaks to mitigate the freeze-off during winter, severe winter events. That's times when the temperature dips essentially below 40 degrees and remains there for more than 24 hours. What needs to be continually addressed is the transparency of the natural gas supply in our intrastate pipeline systems to facilitate the integrated management of sources of supply with the demand requirements from the consumer base, particularly electrical generators. We rate the red, the gathering systems and the midstream operations, because while they have registered as critical infrastructure with the Public Utilities Commission and the Texas Railroad Commission, they still have not developed plans to mitigate their reliance on local utility power supply, either by providing backup generation or some sort of battery backup to temporarily give them power in the event of an interruption. Switching to water and wastewater sector, they're a yellow in that they have increased the emergency generation capacity and retrofitted their crews and equipment to respond when conditions are snowy and icy. They continue, and as a consequence, they're rated yellow. They continue to evolve system upgrades to minimize boil water events, which incorporate greater public outreach, including advising customers of how to shut their water off and installing water meters that are tied into a system where the customer can monitor how much water is being pulled into their home. And if they see that continuing to escalate, when in fact it should be zero water going into their home, they can shut the water off. That typically means that there's been a break in their pipeline. Telecommunications has increased their emergency generation capacity at cell towers, and that rates them as a yellow. And what's needed is continued ongoing collaboration with other critical utilities for SCADA purposes. Finally, transportation has updated their emergency operations standard operating procedure to address much more rapidly winter weather conditions. That brings them up to a yellow. What they continue to need to work on is the advanced deployment of resources for extreme weather hits. So again, progress is slow, but some critical issues continue. Let's look forward. Prior to Uri and Viola, market indicators that convey the health of power generation operations for Texas had been sending clear signals for 10 years that there was a revenue sufficiency problem in Texas. These signals were ignored. No steps were taken to mitigate the problems caused by the energy-only market, inability to attract investment and reliable power generation, dispatchable generation. Considering this full spectrum of infrastructure requirements that support a reliable and resilient network of public support structure, some additional challenges remain to be addressed. First, the interstate natural gas market lacks transparency and consequently restricts the effective conduct of acquisition of supplies and resolution of disputes. Second, the response time for publicly governed infrastructure inhibits the timely intervention and funding of changes required to address changes in demand for services, as in growth of the population, new industries coming in, and the like. And finally, investment challenges initiated by market approaches that understate the true costs associated with the required services, especially when demand conditions are rapidly changing. Slide 18. Note in this graph that margins for power generation have generally declined over the period between 2011 and 2020, which suggests a market design that was not attractive to incremental investment in dispatchable power generation, and one that would lead to the degradation from underinvestment by existing generation. This was occurring at the same time that increased non-dispatchable generation required increasing levels of flexible, reliable, and responsive operational support from dispatchable resources to complement the unpredictable and variable nature of output from non-dispatchable renewable resources. The result was predictable, an increased frequency where interruption of service to end users is more likely. Signals of impending issues with power generation were issued during the major weather event of 2011. In 9 of the 10 following years, the signal consistently sent the same message that the model was not working, and it was ignored. For other Texas infrastructure, triggering mechanisms that would suggest a need for review and investment to maintain high standards of service include constrained access to cellular telecommunication services during severe weather events. So if you lose cell phone service in the early stages of a weather event, that suggests that there needs to be some additional bandwidth created for covering these events and communicating with the public. Increased congestion on highways during time frames that would usually be considered off hours. And finally, notable degradation of service exemplified by increases in boil water notices for potable water supply. Think Houston over the last 3 years. And second, excessive spills of untreated sewage into rivers and streams. Market pricing signals that are impacted by essential infrastructure teach us some things about where we are seeing signals that reliability and resilience are being compromised. So in dynamic markets, pricing signals, especially localized pricing signals, include in the ERCOT system, congestion costs on electrical transmission, and in the natural gas industry, access related constraints to takeaway capacity, that is limited pipeline or processing capacity, that drive prices downward for trapped production, that is production that is landlocked and can't get moved to the Gulf Coast or and even into negative pricing. Meaning a producer is paying a third party to take their natural gas. And that happened before the onslaught of the pandemic. We did have a period of time where natural gas was being was negatively priced in the marketplace. The notice of primary receipt points, which reflects reduced flexibility. The interruption of interruptible transport to serve firm transport and storage customers. So people, entities that have paid for firm transport and yet have that transport interrupted, that's a signal. That's a signal that the market and our infrastructure are not meeting the needs of a reliable and resilient infrastructure. Excess demand periods where scarce resources, supply and or transportation, are bid up to prices not reflective of more stable periods, which is what we experienced certainly with natural gas and to a large degree with electricity during our winter storms Uri and Viola, and in any period including hot temperature, as in the summertime. The common factor of these price signals is that they provide a transparent indicator that needs to be responded to. And unfortunately, we don't always respond. The future, our reality check. When I was attending the Energy Bar Association's Energy Symposium, I heard a rather interesting and enlightening approach suggested to how we think about where we are now. And that is that the world is engaged now in addressing an energy convergence compared to an energy transition phase. There are potentially new the potential emerging view is that there is no silver bullet answer. All of the above energy sources are required, including wind, solar, nuclear. Now, as we have learned today, the potential for the advent of fusion generated power. Hydrogen, ExxonMobil has announced that at their Baytown facility, they are going to build a hydrogen production operation. 50% of the hydrogen produced will go to their refining operations. The other 50% will be made available for the marketplace. Natural gas will continue to be part of the mix, and geothermal and hydroelectric. The mix of options for energy production will vary by region and will be influenced by the available sources of energy and local public and political drivers. Finally, demand management will play an increasing role in addressing electrical power consumption during peak load periods, including voluntary participation when ERCOT text messages you and asks you to reduce power, or asks you via television networks to reduce power. And some involuntary methods, which include remote controlled reduction of demand using thermostats that are connected to power companies, hot water heaters also connected to power companies, and a greater emphasis and activity associated with energy efficiency. We've transitioned from calling it power Well, it's now called energy efficiency. I'll just put it that way. I'm blanking on what they used to call it. Energy savings. Energy efficiency includes insulation, appliances that are energy efficient, and heating and cooling equipment that have a very high rating for energy efficiency. Looking forward, we are planning updates to the Beyond Storms report. So there'll be a summer refresh, which is taking into account what happened during the summer of 2022. And that targets a February 2020, we're targeting a February 2023 release. And what we want to explore is what happened as ERCOT broke records, demand records 11 times during summer 2022, reaching an all-time summer peak demand of 80,038 megawatts on the 20th of July, and a series of new peaks in June and August. 2022 also had an incremental 3,750 MW of wind capacity and 4,100 megawatts of additional solar capacity from 2021. But unfortunately, not reported, 3 thermal generation plants declared bankruptcy during summer of 2022. 2 of those power plants declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which meant that they were going to reorganize. But 1 declared Chapter 7 bankruptcy, which was meaning that they planned to just strip and sell off the components. The Public Utilities Commission intervened and found a way to get them switched to a Chapter 11 approach. So we want to evaluate the changes made that are impacting these 3 high-level focus issues. And there'll be a winter refresh targeting winters 2022 and 2023 that we are looking to release in June of 2023. And in that report, we will look at the demand, ERCOT's response to demand and performance, as well as evaluating what the legislature is doing, because by June 2023, the 88th Texas legislature will have finished, and we will see what they have or have not done to address our infrastructure. Finally, we want to extend our thanks to the presenters of this series of webinars: Jeffrey Roberts, Wes Oliphant, Sherolson, Patricia Freire, Griselda Gonzalez, and me, Oliver Smith. We all greatly appreciated the questions that you asked and the involvement that we anticipate you will have in the community, and in particular with the legislature, as we seek, as the American Society of Civil Engineers, to enhance the reliability and resilience of the infrastructure in our state and flip the script as we seek to be a shining star for the country and the world. And now back to Chris for taking your questions and us answering them. Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. So now I will open it up to questions. I see one from Otis Foster. Let's see. He discussed with Mark Boyd, our VP Tech elect, the question of whether the ASE report unfairly hammers wind and solar and inappropriately encourages the greater use of fossil fuels through dispatchable energy. So from past presentations and some study of this issue, that wind and solar had little to negligible impact on the grid's near collapse during Winter Storm Uri. The greatest impact to the grid was the during the event was the loss of production from natural gas energy and other fossil fuel sources. Is this true? And if it's true, why does the ASCE report recommend a more difficult market for wind and solar power in Texas? And why are the wind and solar being penalized for the lack of performance by fossil fuels?
Jeff, I'll let you take the first stab and then I'll come at it. Jeff, you're muted.
It was such a great answer too. To really look at this question, we first have to start with the understanding of the differences in the types of generation. The non-dispatchable generation, predominantly wind and solar, are producing when and if their resource is available. That's in contrast with dispatchable generation, which is there when we ask it to be. It turns on and off as needed. Now, clearly over time, battery storage will help to make the intermittent or non-dispatchable generation feel more like dispatchable generation. But for dealing with what we have right now, to satisfy ultimately what the customer is looking for, which is reliability at the flip of a switch, dispatchable generation is a critical piece of that. The other piece that's interesting to take a look at is the volatility of production from non-dispatchable sources is a lot. It swings a lot across the system. It swings throughout the day. In turn, you need another source of generation that is adequately financed, that can basically be there reliably supporting that ramping up and down. So I think it's not so much of a either of an or, and it's more of the two need to work together. Increased wind and solar is coming to Texas, is coming across the country, across the world. But along with it, we need to think very hard about the reliability and resilience issue. Now, coming back to your first part of your question, wind and solar had some challenges clearly during the storm. And I don't think that there's anyone that ignores that. I think it was overwhelmed with, at the same time, there was deliverability and interdependence problems on the electric and in turn the natural gas industry in particular. However, I'd note that, and this gets back to some of the modeling concerns that we had, typically in the winter, your peak demand periods are twice a day. During the summer, it's typically once a day. During the winter, it's typically in the morning before the sun rises and in the evening after the sun sets. So when your system needs you the most, it's typically not a period of time, for example, that solar would be available to produce. That's not degrading solar or taking away its capacity. It's a question of how do we solve and match the sources of generation to meet the sources of demand. And so I think it's really, it's one where the one final piece that's happened is that solar and wind have been heavily subsidized. At the federal level, it equates to somewhere around $25 a megawatt hour, which is not insignificant between production tax credits and other incentives. But then we've also incentivized that in part in Texas by doing upgrades to our transmission system to allow more remote source of generation to come to the market. The result of that is it's not necessarily a wind or solar's fault that created the issue, but the market model basically, it created a situation where that subsidized generation that's intermittently available is driving down the energy price, which sounds like a good thing in the short run until it isn't available at that flip of the switch. And so it's not, again, I'll repeat, it's not the renewable sources a problem that they created, the fact that they're subsidized, but it's more the model that they're then plugged into. You have basically subsidized generator and non-subsidized generator. And in the energy only market, there wasn't a recognition of reliability and the value of reliability in the marketplace. So all those factors came together. We tried very hard to be agnostic on the particular source of generation. And in turn, we really focused around the issue of reliability and resilience. And we didn't try and pick winners one way or the other, but recognize that however we make those choices, however the market makes those choices, it's really important for us to be considering how those choices impact reliability and resilience? Great question.
And
Thank you.
great question. And let me add again that we are in what is now being termed an energy convergence. If you look at Europe today, the wind is not blowing at 13 miles an hour, which is the minimum necessary in order for wind turbines to generate electricity. As a consequence, pricing of electricity and natural gas is going up. So there has to be, as Jeff pointed out, a balance. And what we focused on was addressing resilience and reliability in the report. So I would encourage all of you to not just pay attention to how Texas is transitioning, and Texas is on the forefront in the United States for renewable energy. As a consequence, we are uncovering the challenges associated with having a reliable and resilient power grid for the other two grids to pay attention to. And we're also watching what is happening in Europe, where there's a significant reliance on renewables. Thank you for that question.
Okay, we got one follow-up that I read that subsidies and incentives are given to both fossil fuels and wind and solar, and when looked in detail appear to be relatively similar dollar amount. Can you comment on the difference in the subsidies provided to wind and solar and incentives provided to fossil fuels?
I'll let Jeff respond to that because I'm not aware of fossil fuels receiving, certainly generation sources associated with fossil that use thermal generation, i.e. burn coal or natural gas. Jeff, I'll let you take that one.
Sure. While the aggregate amounts, depending upon how you look at it, may be similar, for a depletion allowance, a whole bunch of this starts to get very complicated in a tax situation from one to the other. But I think what ends up happening is a challenge is how does it come down at the I'll use the term at the coal face or at the grid interface, and that's where you're seeing a lot of generation being valued the same, whether it is dispatchable or non-dispatchable, and that is a critical mechanism. And if, for example, if there was a greater incentive around reliability, then you might start to see some of these subsidies be a little more transparent. They've grown up over time. The renewable industry has been challenged by the fact that production tax credits typically have a sunset provision. When solar and renewables no longer need to be subsidized, and they shouldn't be subsidized, but it keeps getting renewed. And those are public policy issues beyond the scope here. But it's the outcome of the subsidy which is the most important. And so when effectively, when transmission is subsidized to bring in power, that maybe that cost should be borne by that incremental source, is one of those examples where you start to have that mismatch versus kind of a peanut butter approach where everybody is paying for it. So this is a really complicated issue. And you're asking the right question, and it's appropriate to shine a bright light on it. I will say parts of it are very arcane, and it's a very complex answer to get down, and it depends upon how you think about how things are coming through in the dispatch decisions versus the build originally. All those issues come into play. So it's a little more complex than what we'd be able to solve on this call. But I would be more than happy to follow up afterwards with you if that's appropriate.
Thank you for the question or the follow-up.
Great, and I think that's about time. I think we don't have any more questions, so I want to thank you all for participating in today's ASE Texas Section technical webinar. And thank you very much to our presenters, Jeff Roberts and Oliver Smith from the Beyond Storms Infrastructure Network Resilience